Si invita il gentile pubblico a ricordare di ritirare il proprio documento e restituire le cuffie alla fine dell'evento. Grazie.
Do you want to be in the middle? Or do you...
All right, good evening to everyone. Thanks for being here. To begin with, I'll make a quick presentation. I'm Leonardo Bianchi, a news editor for Vice Italy and staff writer for Vice News Italy. I've been covering the Greek crisis for the past few years, mostly for the collective blog Valigia Blu and other news outlets. On my right, is Theopi Skarlatos, is it correct? Right. Who is a journalist and filmmaker. She's co-director with Kostas Kalergis, a Greek journalist, of the documentary Love in the Time of Crisis. And she's the director of This Is a Coup, which is the 4-part documentary series made for Field of Vision, which is the visual film unit of the Intercept, and which is a documentary that we are going to watch later on. And on my right, there is also Paul Mason, former producer of This Is a Coup, and former economics editor for Channel 4 News in the UK, and for the BBC Two Newsnight program. Paul also authored several books, including such titles as Meltdown, The End of the Age of Greed, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolutions, and his latest, Post-Capitalism, A Guide to Our Future, which is also out in Italy for the publisher Il Saggiatore. Very briefly, the documentary captures what has been a very, very tumultuous year for Greece. And moreover, as the title puts it, shows how the European Union destroyed the first radical left government in modern history. As you surely know, Syriza, which is a left-wing party coalition led by Alexis Tsipras, won the first general elections in 2015 with the promise to end austerity, which has been ravaging the country for the past 5 years. And in June 2015, the tense and very locked negotiations with the so-called Troika, which is a body formed by the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Union. These negotiations have been going on for several months. In the end, came to a dramatic showdown, and with an unprecedented move, Alexis Tsipras announced the referendum on the third bailout proposal, and the referendum took place on the 5th of June, and the no vote, which means that the majority of the Greek people voted no, the famous hockey, voted no to the bailout proposals, and basically to austerity. But the clash wasn't over yet, because on July 12th, during a very dramatic confrontation between the lenders, Germany most of all, and Alexis Tsipras, eventually a deal was struck, and it came after an all-night negotiation during which Alexis Tsipras was subjected, according to one source, was subjected to mental waterboarding. And basically, in the end, the Greeks caved in, and the third bailout was the reality was like approved. And during this final negotiation, also the hashtag "This is a coup," which is the title of the documentary, was born in Barcelona, according to a Guardian article, and quickly trended worldwide, sparking a very large social media backlash against Germany and its finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble. And so right now we're going to discuss all of these issues with Paul and Theopi before the screening. We'll have a Q&A session after our chat, and then we're going to see the documentary. So my first question is pretty straightforward. How did you come up with the idea of this documentary?
Well, so I had been covering the crisis for the BBC for a while, and I'd been going backwards and forwards from Greece. And it was pretty depressing. And although people had been out on the streets protesting in 2011 and it felt like there was hope, somehow during 2014 that just seemed to have died. And then suddenly along came this party, Syriza, and it felt like once again there seemed to be hope in the air. And then at the beginning of last year, I made a film called End of Austerity. It's a short film, you can see it online, about this crazy radical left party that was gaining in popularity. And really, that was something that we knew that we had to stick with and that we had to film, because suddenly people who we were interviewing, who we were speaking to, were starting to think that actually there could be change, that they could change things, that, you know, next year life might not be as it is right now. And then eventually Syriza went on to win that election, and I'd been filming for a few weeks maybe, but we knew that we couldn't put the cameras down. And Paul had come out, he was reporting at the time, I think for Channel 4 was it, and we met up on that night of the election in shock and just thought, we've got to try and find the money to continue filming. So really that's how the project began.
And so my day job was, until 3 weeks ago, as a reporter on one of the main news bulletins in Britain, Channel 4 News. And I'd been covering Greece for 5 years, both for BBC and then for Channel 4 News. And we decided that we needed to make it on that night of Syriza's victory. But one of the reasons that I thought we had to make it as a documentary was that I'm doing this day in, day out, trying to intervene, trying to get access to the process that's going on. There is no template for a left government. There's no template for what happens when people who had 4% 5 years ago get 35% and win the election. And I was aware, because we had worked together when we were at the BBC, on covering Greece, of how little the mainstream media, even really good mainstream media, because I think we were really good mainstream media, even really good mainstream media could not get the story, because you are constantly parachuting in, you go to a village, you listen to 3 people, you head for somewhere where there's an edit suite. You never get the depth. You're relying on Greek speakers, and you're relying on them having an understanding of popular culture and demotic language. And sometimes that's quite hard even for educated Greek people if you go to a village. But what we did with the documentary from the beginning, because we'd already done it on this short 15-minute film that covered the election period, from the start with the documentary, we said, okay, we're going to hire Greek video journalists, and it's going to be them, together with Theopi, who was the director of photography and first camera, it's going to be them who find this. And so we allocate, in the end, when we found our characters and our villages, we allocated specific teams of people to go and do that.
I was just going to say, and also this is, it's the story of a financial crisis, and mainstream media will cover it in figures, in numbers, and it's only very recently, over the last couple of years, I'd say, that people started looking at this not just as an economic crisis, but as a humanitarian crisis where real people's lives are being impacted. And that's not necessarily a story that you can tell in a 1-minute package or a 3-minute news package, or even properly in a 15-minute short film. So it was amazing to be able to try and tell the story of the Greek financial crisis, not only on a political level, but also at a level, ground level as well, with, real normal people who had to live through the crazy year that was 2015.
I have another question for both of you, which is, what is your relationship with Greece?
Do you want to go first?
I will. Well, I'm quite well known now in Greece. If I tweet something, it becomes national news, which just tells you something about the low status of some of the Greek media. But my sister once dated a Greek guy a long time ago, 20 years ago, and I spent a lot of time going backwards and forwards to Greece then. He was a member of this tiny, tiny left party called Synaspismos. And so, sitting, as you do, in Greek tavernas or on a beach with nothing else to talk about, I kind of learned everything there is to know and more about this tiny group, Synaspismos, which, of course, 20 years later is Syriza. And so, I was in Davos when the crisis started in 2010, and the Euro crisis began, and could see George Papandreou, the minister, and a finance minister called Papa Constantinou, right at the heart of the storm. They looked literally, because they're surrounded by photographers, literally like rabbits in a headlight. And I just thought then, I know what's going to happen here, because the Greek left are serious. They had a civil war. You cannot walk into a village or to a cafeteria on a coffee shop without an old guy, once you get to know them, will spontaneously tell you what happened in the war. And I knew how serious this was going to get if the Europeans didn't go in and manage it to a swift conclusion. And so I really immersed myself in it. We went several times. I've been several times a year ever since then to cover it, and I think I'm beginning to understand Greek culture and politics, but beginning after 5 years.
And you speak a little bit too.
Oh.
Well, you can probably tell from my name that I'm part Greek, and my father's Greek. And I grew up in the UK, but we would continuously go backwards and forwards at Easter time or summertime to visit. And my father left Greece 34 years ago to come and live in the UK. And his biggest fear is that I think anyway, that I will actually go back and live in Greece, because apparently Greece is good for holidays, but not really to live. A place to live. And I think that's the most depressing thing. And so it interests me, how Greece can get back on its feet and how it can become, once again, as it is in my memories, an amazing place to live and to work. And so, yeah, that is my relationship with Greece, and that's what interests me about the country.
Or I have a more technical question, which is, what was your strategy for reporting and covering the story?
What was that?
The strategy for reporting and covering the story.
Well, okay. So the strategy for reporting and covering the story, as we did here in the documentary.
Oh, the doc.
Yeah. Okay. So We realised, because both of us had spent some time gaining access and trust among Syriza politicians and among the mass of people who supported them, that there was a possibility that we would be able to be close to the action inside the government when the crunch came. But this, when we began, was really just a possibility. We therefore decided to, first of all, we raised money, we crowdfunded it. This is the second biggest crowdfunded documentary in the UK in 2015. So, and it's public what we raised. It was £45,000, which is, we thought, hooray, £45,000. But, so we knew we had some resources and that we could hire young Greek video journalists to help us do it. But the first impulse, wasn't it, was to say, let's tell the story of communities. So we had one team focused on a mountain community that barely makes it to this documentary for reasons we can discuss. But we went again and again to this community. We went to the port community of Piraeus, which is a very tough working class area, historically communist, and historically therefore not Syriza. And we knew we had to film as much as we could of this huge milieu, which also exists here in Italy, of horizontal, autonomous activists. The only problem is they don't like being filmed. So we just put teams into that, and Theopi did it. I was still doing my job, covering the UK election, covering Scottish election, etc. And I kept saying to you that the one instruction was, always ask, what's going on now? How do you feel about it? And what do you think is going to happen? And because we didn't want it, people's natural response when you sit them down or you catch them as they go by, they tell you what they think of what has just happened before. But the documentary is not an analytical documentary. What it turned out to be is almost like a real-time slow-motion car crash as it happens. There is no reflection in it whatsoever. And so that was a conscious decision. But then, and maybe you could pick up the story, then at the crucial moment, we actually did get access to the government, which wasn't easy, but we got it. And that then shaped the way we carried on.
Yeah, and it was, as you were saying, a traumatic time for so many people. And I've spoken to people recently who've watched it, and they say, I was glued to the screen and my heart was racing, and, I didn't know, what would happen in the next scene. And that's, if that's how you feel after you've watched it, then I think we've achieved something, because really it's a document of what happened, and it will be there online, hopefully forever, for people in the future to go back and see actually what happened. It's not analytical. I would like to make an analytical documentary that goes back and looks at what happened and what went wrong and what could have happened. But hopefully this doc will take you through those months as we lived it, because every day we would wake up and not know what was going to happen if we were waking up, because there were many nights when we didn't even sleep, because we would wake up in a cold sweat, and the entire team was like that. Sometimes it was hard to function. Were we going to stay in Europe? Were we out of Europe? Were the banks going to be closed? What was going to happen? We didn't know. So hopefully it will have that effect on you when you watch it.
How was the documentary actually received in Greece?
Well, I think it made the news, didn't it, for 2 days?
Well, it certainly, making the news in Greece is not hard, but we did make the news big time. Look, the problem is for them, for those who have not seen it and those who won't get a chance to see it now, it's free to view online. Laura Poitras's documentary vehicle, Field of Vision, commissioned it, and it is free to view there. It's free to view on our YouTube channel, and in high definition, and you can watch it in the 4 episodes, the original format. But when it went out online only, but many of the Greek news channels we allowed them, 2 minutes worth of excerpt, and they picked it up. And the thing is, they'd never seen any politicians before like that. Because, to my knowledge, there has never been an Access documentary made inside the Prime Minister's office and the mansion it's called the Maximu Mansion, and the HQ of Syriza. There have been some good documentaries made about Syriza, but there's never been this. And the access we got, if you watch the doc, is about 3 points. It's when they're about to win the referendum, when they win the referendum, when they're just about to go bankrupt, and then when, again, afterwards, a long time afterwards, months, when they finally will allow us back in. Because at every other point, at some critical points, they shut the door. So people in Greece think that I have a kind of security pass into the Prime Minister's office. It's not true. We had to really work for that. But what we worked for and achieved, those 3 or 4 points where we're there, no Greek has ever seen a politician like that, which is crazy anyway. But then when you see Tsipras, who is a magnetic character, I think that's how it was received as, wow, who knew that you could do this? And we didn't know at the start. We thought it was going to be about ordinary people. And it is quite about ordinary people. And I think that they were... Of course, the other thing is there's a huge hate campaign against both of us, but especially me, by the Greek centre-right. And who cares? But just block people on Twitter.
Well, I think many journalists wondered, how did we get the access, and felt like, why did we get the access? Because, we were largely a British team, and why didn't Greek journalists get the same access? But I think that, in order to make a good documentary, in order to get good interviews, there has to be an element of trust. And I think we'd been working on that for quite a long time. And remember, during this period, everybody wanted to know every journalist wanted to know what was going on, and every journalist wanted to publish it at the time that it was happening. And we'd built up this element of trust, and the politicians knew that whatever we were filming, it was with us, and it was not going to be published online. It wouldn't go anywhere, because we wanted to make a documentary. We were not making news, and we did not want to influence what was going on politically either.
All right. I wanted to talk about Syriza and its rise to power, basically. My question is, how, like a party that in 2009 got 4.6% of the vote, 5 years later wins the elections?
Yeah.
Well,
and they won 2 elections as well.
I feel like Greek people, as I was saying before, had largely given up because they felt like they'd tried everything. There were many violent demonstrations. There were then peaceful demonstrations with the indignant movement. And then I think finally they just decided they were going to give politics a go. And this was, amazing, because so many people we spoke to had, if you watch the first film, End of Austerity, they say, every politician is the same. We've given up on politics. We don't want this. But then I think back then people saw Syriza as, as a party that was different. They seemed clean. They didn't seem corrupt like, previous politicians had proved to be.
I mean, look, there's a lot of reasons. The number one reason that they were able so easily to go, and easily, was, in the June 2012 election, which they only just lost, I can remember being in the HQ, and one of their senior members hugged me and said, "Thank God we lost," because they knew they needed a level of technocratic expertise. And the way they went from 27% in June 2012 to 36% in January 2015 was not simply to be an effective parliamentary opposition, although they were a very effective parliamentary opposition. They managed to recruit some very good people from the collapse of the Social Democratic Party, PASOK. So there's a whole layer of people around Tsipras who are to the right of him, but only a bit, who have social democratic training and expertise. That's one thing. How did they get from 4% to 17 and then 20 and then 25? The crucial moment is the 2011 uprising, the movement of the plateas, the squares. This was arguably just as deep a movement as it was in Spain with the Indignados. And what I think the general drift of history has been since 2011 is for people, educated people, to first of all find their own power. The sociologist Manuel Castells basically describes it as it's an internet network coming from the internet into reality in his book Networks of Outrage and Hope. But having done that, first you're repressed. I mean, in Greece it was tear gas, in Spain the rubber bullets. Educated people draw the conclusion we can only go so far through protest. So what about if we go back to politics? Meanwhile, Tsipras, legendarily, the story is he was standing in the office of Parliament watching the riot going on, and he just says, those are the people who are going to get us into power. Now, many people I know even anarchists, and Greek anarchists are really, really autonomist, black-shirted, black, hoodie. I know even some of those joined the party because they felt it was the only way they could effect change. As we'll find out, of course, the party remained a very hierarchical, old-style Euro-communist party, much less reformed than its Italian equivalents. And so you'll see a scene, if you stick around, when we see the Central Committee, and the front row of the Central Committee is grey-haired old men. And you don't see the masses inside the party structures, but it was enough for the masses to go and not only vote, they have these networks, like of food networks or self-help networks. And I think, in other words, they developed a very resilient movement, and they developed a very effective professional parliamentary opposition. And then the Europeans messed it up. The Europeans continually failed to give the Greek right or centre any concessions. And at that point, the stage was set for what you see.
Right now, I wanted to switch to the negotiations and the referendum. And my question is, did you expect that the confrontation between Syriza, the Greek government, and the Troika would have ended so badly?
No. I think it was Varoufakis who says the creditors seem to be the only creditors who want to lend money but never receive it back. I mean, I remember at the time just thinking, surely, that people must start to think now with common sense. They must come to some kind of agreement. It can't, end like this. And the next day after it happened, I remember going out and filming outside Parliament. And it was the saddest day I think I've ever seen, and nobody knew what to do with themselves. If you can imagine, the last few months, all of this hope, everybody thinking that they can change something, everybody for the first time behind their own politicians. I mean, when was the last time that actually happened in Greece? Nobody can remember. And then suddenly, a new bailout's being signed, and nobody knew what to do with themselves. And there was this weird eeriness and quiet and calm. And there's a shot, I think it's one of my favorite shots in the film, of this woman who stood there with this Greek flag, and she's just turning around, not looking at anything. And it was a very strange day.
As a daily news journalist, I had a good access to both sides. I talked regularly to the ECB, IMF, Commission, other governments, Syriza, other parties in Greece. And what I think the jigsaw in my mind that has built up is like this, that nobody really had a clue about one thing, and that was that Germany, by the end of it, would press the button that would to break the Eurozone. See, Renzi, Obama, Hollande all said to Syriza, to Tsipras, we will not let the Germany crush you or expel you from the Eurozone. And the deal will be tough, but it'll be a deal you can sign. And therefore, both sides expected there to be kind of a theatrical fight. Okay? So Syriza expected that it would make a fight and that they would come back and there would be a compromise, and at the end of it there would be debt relief and a sustainable deal. And this failed. Now, the British Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, before 2010, wanted to meet Obama. And what he got was a 5-minute meeting in a corridor in the White House. No cameras, nothing. This was seen as a huge slight. Varoufakis got 20 minutes with Obama in public with cameras on them. And what is the message there? The message is, don't worry. And this was what they got wrong, what we got wrong. I thought it'd be over by May, and I thought there would be a token resistance. But I did know one thing, and we both knew this, yeah? That if it came to a fight, a lot of people in financial markets thought Syriza would never fight. They would say, he's just like Tony Blair, he's just all show. And we knew they would fight. And that's why we kept the cameras rolling. And, long after the £45,000 had disappeared, because we knew it would come to something then.
And still nobody really knows what happened with Tsipras inside that room during those negotiations where he was cooped up without a translator for about 7 hours or something. And I hope that one day people, or that he himself will be open and speak about that, because I think that is what is needed, more transparency, basically.
Do you think that Tsipras made the right decision to call a referendum?
It's like if you are, if you're on the Eastern Front in World War II and your back is to the river Volga, is it a good idea to fight in Stalingrad? No. But unfortunately, if you don't do it, that's the end. And in other words, as a reporter in a conflict, you rarely see such huge strategic forces ranged against each other. And moments arise when nobody can do anything other than what they actually then do. He himself says to me in the documentary, we did it too late. We fought too late. The problem was, what was it about? It was always going to be a moral victory and then a negotiated compromise. Even the compromise that was designed by the French diplomats in the week after the referendum victory, which was rejected by Germany, would have been a compromise. So I think, it's what you could say is that the entire strategy of confrontation was mistaken, knowing what we do now. Because you could have gone, let's stabilize the government, let's take control of ministries, let's clean out the civil service, let's reform the media, because this is a huge issue as well, and then let's choose the confrontation. But the masses were there. They said, why did we sit, my grandmother can't turn on her heating in the winter. She's burning wood and choking. They wanted action then,
well,
didn't they?
I'd say they wanted a referendum. People wanted to have their say. People, in a way, what Tsipras did was he, as we say in the documentary, at that point he knew he couldn't go it alone. And so the referendum, in a sense, was there to kind of give him more power, give him that backing in a way. And if you ask people at the time, I think that they were proud to be able to have that say. Obviously, there are many people who are not obviously happy with the outcome of it. But I remember after finishing this film and our brains were everywhere, our exec producer, Karen O'Connor, said, what is this film about? And our brains were everywhere because it was about so many different things. It was about the people, it was about humanity, it was about the crisis. And she just said, didn't she, it's about democracy, damn it. It's about democracy. And I think that's probably what Tsipras, was thinking. It's democracy. It's about people having their say, and then eventually nobody listening.
I think you'll see him in the documentary. He says it in his not perfect English, but it's something like, this is a historic time because never before did people actually get a direct vote on a major thing that was being inflicted on them. I think he still thinks that there was a moral victory in simply resisting so long and holding the referendum. But as you all know, the Greek left is now completely split. There's a lot of people on the streets who completely dislike Tsipras. So that's a different.
I always speak
viewpoint.
about my godfather, who would, back in the beginning of 2015, would have thought that, Tsipras would have loved it if I'd, married Tsipras. Wouldn't that have been amazing? And now he wants to kill him. So that's you can see the difference.
All right. One of the things that, in my opinion, really stands out from the documentary is that it really highlights the democratic deficit at the core of the European Union. And I mean, it's not really a question, but is it like the European government system, how it is right now, like totally broken, or is there some sort of hope left that things could work out in some sort of way?
I think it is broken, yeah. But I think these are the days now. This is the times that we're living in. That's when it will be determined whether it can be fixed or not. I think that there are organizations, there are parties, there are people out there who want to make change. But whether that will be able to happen or not, I really don't know. But we're living in very interesting times. There's with the referendum happening in the UK as well, and time will tell.
I think this was one step in what to me looks like the descent of the European Union into a force-based organization. So because you can smash Greece, you smash Greece. Because you can delay the European Central Bank for 5 years, doing whatever every other central bank did 5 years ago, you do it. Those who believe in the European Union don't just believe in its principles, but the acquis and we call it in French the acquis, the modalities of Europe, and of course the rules. I've reported on migrants, refugees in Tangier who try to sail to Europe in little dinghies and either always drown or fail. Yeah? They're trapped in Tangier because the Gibraltar Strait is too wide and too rough to go across. Sometimes they make it. And because they can't force their way into Europe, nobody cares about them. I'm very pro-refugees, but in a way what you have to realize is that the ones who came managed it because they did something. They broke through a fence. And the fear, I think, that the Greek crisis shows is that if people see this institution descend into, instead of the rule of law, the rule of what you can do, or flamboyant gestures, like Schäuble gets out a paper on the night of the referendum, on the night of the negotiation, and says, okay, our proposal is you leave the Eurozone and we give you some humanitarian aid. And the other Europeans are going, what? Hold on a minute, where did this come from? We don't want Europe to be a gesture-based or force-based institution, and that's to me what the danger going forward is.
All right. I have a question for Paul, which is related to his latest book. Do you see some signs of post-capitalism in Greece?
I've written a book called Post-Capitalism, which looks at the peer-to-peer economy and collaborative economy as a much more dynamic answer to the crisis we are living through. This will not be new to many Italian listeners because the collaborative economy and of course you have Negri, you have Vercellone, you have the theorists of cognitive capitalism. Now, interestingly, in Greece, Syriza had a wing of the party that were very pro this collaboration. There was a mapping exercise which found hundreds of small and 70 big peer-to-peer economies in Greece, like free Wi-Fi networks in mountainous villages, or parallel currencies, or time banks. And half of the team of the Deputy Prime Minister, Yanis Dragasakis, was kind of working on this until the moment they got into power. But as soon as they're in power, it's like running a war. And really, I think a problem is they never asked themselves, what could this peer-to-peer thing do for the resilience of the population. Probably it spontaneously did something, but for example, if you then compare that to Podemos in Spain and En Comú, which is the Podemos-aligned movement which took over Barcelona, there the weight of the peer-to-peer and collaborative projects is much greater. They are essentially a horizontal peer-to-peer movement, whereas Syriza was essentially a 1970s era, Euro-communist party with some Trotskyists and some anarchists and some social democrats attached to it.
All right. I have a final question, then we will pick up the question from the audience. And last week, WikiLeaks released the transcript of a teleconference between the IMF chief negotiator and the head of the IMF mission to Greece, in Greece. In the conversation, the IMF basically anticipated a possible Greek default, or as Paul Thompson calls it, an event, and which coincides with the Brexit referendum. And my question is, what are the implications of these revelations, and should we expect another Brexit-like situation?
Well, I was just going to say that is what I'm worried about, because I am heading out to Greece end of April, and payments need to be made. And we could be seeing a repeat of 2015, and I could find myself in the exact same situation if the papers are to be believed. I hope that's not the case, and I hope that there is common sense still there, and that something can be worked out, and that there will be debt relief for Greece, because I think 99% of people agree that that is the way forward.
I was just in touch before we came on stage with somebody who'd been in the talks today between the IMF, the European Union and Greece. There's no breakthrough in those talks, and the IMF is maintaining its official tough position of no deal without debt restructuring, and that Germany maintains it, and the European Union maintains its position that there cannot be debt restructuring. And so we could I think we will end up with another showdown, but this time with a country that's had 1 million refugees flow through it, that has maybe 100,000 people, that is being tasked to do a very, very tricky thing that may be illegal with the Turkish return policy. But one of my disappointments about the documentary is that we don't yet have 3D feely documentaries where you can feel, where you can make somebody's hair stand on end because that's how it feels. Because the missing bit of this is the psychology of economic siege. We both lived through it, and like Theopi said, even the team were traumatized. Even people whose income is secure were traumatized by the banks close, a horrible quiet descends on society, and people really, they listen to rumors, literally rumors like the Nestle factory's closed, there's no more baby milk, and they start phoning each other. And the psychological trauma, what I say is to play with that, to even suggest that it might be a good idea to do that again, I would say is a really stupid thing to do.
No, it was just a slight point that it is very difficult to explain, because there was this psychological trauma, but yet at the same time, it was unbelievable how Greek people dealt with, their banks being closed and their withdrawals being limited. And I think it was, 60 euros that you were allowed to take out per day. And to them, that was a joke. For some people, they thought it was amazing. Wow, we can take 60 euros out a day. I don't even do that a week. So I think although people dealt with it, amazingly well, there was still this, trauma at the same time, which is very difficult to make people understand.
Let's go with the questions from the audience.
That's it.
Hi, I'm wondering whether you actually think that rather than it being a detriment to Greece, whether Greece might be able to potentially leverage the refugee crisis in order to secure some sort of debt haircut.
Okay, so could the Greek government leverage the current refugee crisis to secure debt relief? I think rather what is happening is this, is that what started out was with, the defeated Syriza realized that they would have to stay in power to soften the blow on Greek society, because if the right comes back, we've reported, haven't we? We've reported on, the right. I'm talking about the conservative right, the mainstream centrist right in Greece. It is prone to unrestrained use of police forces against migrants. Really in a very shocking way. The armed forces, without the restraint of a left government, there are elements in those armed forces who would only too happily sink the boats. And so I think Syriza's first response was, let's thank God it's us in power. But the next thing is, they then realized, they never said this, but psychologically it's apparent to me, that the crisis is so big that only Europe can help them solve it. That in other words, they're not just captives of an economic deal, they are captives, in a good way, of a solidarity. And weirdly, having hated each other during the economic crisis, there's no, I wouldn't say perfect communication between Berlin and Athens, but no, at least Berlin and Athens are actually on the same page, which is of a humanitarian deal that tries to make the best out of this. And now it's the Visegrad countries, who both Greece and Germany see as a big problem. But I don't think there's any intention to kind of give us the money, otherwise the refugee crisis goes crazy. There is, of course, the threat, not right now, but I think further along the line. If Syriza falls, there won't be a conservative government. There'll be a technocratic government, second one in 5 years. That's the plan of the Greek establishment. This technocratic government will mess up, and then the problem is that we are really lucky that the fascists want to be black-shirted type hoodlums, because in other countries fascists developed a brain and reinvented themselves as democratic politicians. And so we're lucky for the moment that the fascists have no chance of ruling Greece, but that may not be the case forever.
I don't have it.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. So you said that Germany squished Greece because they could do it. So you said, just because you can do it, you do it. But I'm wondering, how much is the person, so a single person with its psychology, the one to press the button to squeeze Greece, and how much is a plan so there's more corporate interest? So I would like to know better about this. So either it's a psychopath that pressed the button, or there's a story behind and Germany does it because there are interests. Thank you.
Is this, I couldn't really hear very well, is it a question about whether they wanted to kill Syriza? Is that the...
Are you saying, is it a corporate interest versus is it a national interest? Is that what you're...
It's a person that was at the negotiation. So is it a single person that decides to squeeze the country because
No.
they can do it? Or this person is acting for a corporate,
Yeah.
for someone else?
It's really hard to understand the motivation of what the German political elite did, unless you understand the importance of constitutional law in Germany. So everything, unlike here, every deal, every new thing the European Central Bank does, every new treaty, every new agreement goes one way or another to the German Constitutional Court, and certainly to the Parliament. And we should be, in a way, glad of this, because we should be glad that Germany takes very seriously democratic institutions. But the problem is that, therefore, to my mind, the German political elite, and not just the politicians, the civil servants and the media, completely work in every occasion from rules. It is a rules-based philosophy. You may know that Immanuel Kant famously said that you can only be free inside a rules-based, by obeying rules. And the problem is the rules don't work. but the German political elite doesn't realize that yet, and therefore they continually try to make them work. I think that is actually what's going on. I don't think the corporations, in other words, I don't think there is a big banking and corporate plot against Greece. And in fact, during the crisis, the corporations did the utmost to keep things going.
I was just going to add that also don't forget at the time they had national elections going on, which hugely influenced, I think, their decision. But it is interesting, and in the documentary we do ask Euclid, who was, obviously heavily involved in the negotiations, do you think that they want to kill Syriza? Do you think that that's their plan? They just want to bring the Syriza, the radical left party, down? And his reply, is this on camera? Is this off record? Which I thought was quite telling, And then he gave his answer once he realized that I was actually filming, so who knows?
But I would add, I do think that the European political elite is trying its utmost to suppress and get rid of the first left government in Europe. I really think that is what they're trying to do. But I also think that that's not the only motivation. I think there is an attempt to save, the Lisbon Treaty has articles that say the European Central Bank cannot save governments and that politicians cannot intervene in monetary policy. I mean, if you sign a treaty and it says that, it's better, I think, to address the problem that the treaty is wrong and develop some maturity and resilience and flexibility as a political class. But they won't do it. And if you're a civil servant in Germany, you just have to look at the treaty. It says, no help for Greece. Sorry. And your country in Italy, you have signed that Lisbon Treaty as well, and it applies to you as well. There's somebody here.
Leaving politics aside for a moment, and just from a journalistic point of view, how do you think that the mainstream media reported on the crisis, and what did they do wrong if they did something wrong, and did they completely miss the humanitarian level of the crisis and focus too much on numbers and stats, as you were saying before?
Well, the one thing that I think that members of my family were perhaps shocked by when they watched it, because they live in the UK, was the night just before the referendum, when there was a huge demonstration in the main square outside Parliament for people who were going to vote no, for Syriza supporters. And there was an electric atmosphere that night. It was amazing. People felt like they could have their say, that this was democratic. And that was largely, I think, ignored by mainstream media. And in fact, I don't think anybody really knew what was going on at that point in time. Which is quite interesting. So I think it was always covered as a Grexit. Is Greece in or out? What's going to happen? It was always that. It was never, well, hang on a second, this is actually a point for people to have their say. And then once they have their say, their prime minister is going to take that referendum result to the negotiations and use it as leverage. That was not really touched upon, was it, in mainstream media?
Look, I think the global mainstream media did quite a good job. I think they did a good, given that most of them don't have Greek-speaking correspondents, the Greek-based correspondents of the main media did, I think, a really good job. And I think the Greek media was terrible. You may know that the previous government closed down the state broadcaster. Syriza reopened it, but it only reopened several days before the referendum, so in late June 2015. Now, this itself created a political momentum for the no campaign, because suddenly people realized that what they'd been missing for months, objective, relatively objective, state-funded journalism with good production values. The private media has good production values, but it's all owned by oligarchs, doesn't pay any tax, and doesn't even have a license to use the frequencies they broadcast on. Now, the one thing I would say to fellow journalists in the room that I learned from, however, covering really closely this crisis for 6 months is there was times, wasn't there, when we would sit among other journalists and we would realize they have no idea what's going on. And they're really good And it's not their fault, but they have no idea what's going on. And I realise now that that's not a Greek thing, that's a general thing. I think I'm now in a position to see both sides of the journalism and the inside, say, of British Labour. And most journalists covering British Labour have no idea what's going on either. And I think we have to understand that we generally know very little about what is really happening. Right at the back now.
Hi. Yeah, I got a very, very basic question, actually, and is, so what's the future of Greece now, and what's the future, what will be the future of Syriza, and also the future of Tsipras?
Well, I'm not a mind reader, despite the fact that we made the documentary. What's going to happen? Well, we spoke about, in a few weeks' time, it's a very important period for Greece. Who knows? I mean, I think it's very sad to see the state of Syriza now compared to what it was a year ago. It has broken up. I mean, you see in the doc, Varoufakis is no longer there. One of the main people who is in the doc, Zoe Konstantopoulou, she is not there anymore. She's supporting a completely different party. So Syriza is changing, and it has lost quite a lot of support. I don't know. I mean, I don't really want to say whether, I think that they'll still be in power in a year's time or in a few weeks' time. Or, I mean, during the time that we made the doc, as I say, we didn't know what was going on day to day, and I still think it's impossible to tell what's going to happen.
I think the situation is, the economic situation is, either the IMF gives in or the Europeans give in. If one side or other doesn't give in, it will just drag on till summer. It will collide with the Brexit, just as Paul Thompson says in this leaked document, and there'll probably be a big debt crisis. Now, even then, what is the outcome? I think the most likely outcome, from the point of view of the lenders, is that the IMF does walk away. There is, in other words, then a softer deal for Greece, i.e. less austerity demanded, but no debt relief, and that the IMF's part of the debt is taken on by something called the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism. I mean, that sounds very boring, but it'd be quite big because Germany will have to agree to it, and right now the German Parliament is opposed to that. So that's the way to save Greece. I don't think the other way, which is the IMF, insists on debt relief and everybody agrees to that. I don't think that is going to happen. I think I'm really pessimistic about the geopolitical situation, and I think that we're only at the beginning of this refugee swap deal, and its legality is being challenged. I'm not certain it can be carried out humanely, and if it falls apart, then, you have to accept that you're living in a time in history which for journalists is a very challenging one, but equally very, I think in a way exciting, that you're having to tell stories about things that you didn't expect to happen. And I think that a state bankruptcy is possible for Greece. I think it is possible that Syriza would fall if the pressure from the lenders is combined with a very, a concerted pressure from below. But I'm not sure, as I said before, I'm not sure that the right in Greece wants to or is ready to take over. And so, the worst case scenario is that Greece just carries on as it is. It's got no money. Everybody's earning 400 euros a month or less. Young people, have 3 jobs, no security. And old people, are kind of stumbling along. But that Europe smashes itself up over that issue. And it's a combined issue now of the refugees and the debt of Greece. I am concerned that that's entirely possible. When you see the Austrian government convene a meeting of a bunch of non-EU countries about the refugees and not invite the Greeks, I mean, what is going on?
And I think Greece has always said and still says this is not a Greek problem, it's not a Greek problem, it's a European problem. And actually, I think that now what's interesting is you say what's going to happen to Greece, what's the future of Greece, but I don't think that is the most interesting question. I think now actually it has become what is going to happen to Europe, what will happen to Europe, will Europe still exist in a year or two or whatever, you know. I think actually that has become the reality, that it is about more Europe now rather than Greece itself as an individual country.
And let me just add, of course, the problem is there. We weren't the only people who were able to get some access and some transparency and some, decent reporting. But if you report Brussels, if you're one of those poor people who has to report Brussels, you will know how difficult it is, even for the guys with the press passes to the concilium, to get the story. They just get handed, effectively a series of semi-leaks, spun information. That's why the shock. It's probably well known that I was the recipient of some leaked documents in the February 20th summit, which basically were just being leaked hour by hour, and it completely disorientated both the press corps in Brussels and the rest of the EU, because that wasn't, I think it's fairly obvious that the Greek delegation without revealing the source, took the view that the negotiation should be done Solidarność style, i.e. by openness. And if Europe goes into crisis, we won't have that level of access. And I think as journalists, we need to start fighting for the kind of access that we get to national parliaments and national political elites now has to be focused on the Euro elite. And I am very critical of the Brussels press group, the people who do it. They have accepted way, way too much control by the European Union's institutions over what they do and how they report.
Yeah, they don't even feature in this film, do they?
I mean, they're an irrelevance, to be honest.
Right.
Vi vorrei fare una domanda per mia facilità in italiano, spostando un po' i termini della questione. Vi volevo chiedere se l'uscita di Varoufakis ha contribuito comunque alla perdita di credibilità di Syriza e secondo voi che significato ha avuto, simbolicamente parlando, il fatto che Varoufakis abbia lanciato un nuovo movimento dalla Germania?
Yeah, grazie. Okay, I did. Okay, look, Varoufakis is a really logical guy. He's a logical guy in the sense that he sees the defeat. He sees that if he stays in parliament and in government, he will impose austerity. He doesn't want to do that. Why, above all, as a professor of economics, he staked his reputation on saying that the program does not work. So it is logical for him to leave. In this, I wrote the foreword to Yanis's book, and I said I kind of knew what would happen. In this sense, he will never impose austerity. Now, I think his second logic is, okay, this was a problem of European democracy, let's try and solve that problem, rather than dream about alternative economic strategies for Europe before we solve the essential problem of its lack of democracy and accountability. But, I mean, I think he launched it in Germany for the very good reason that he knows how annoyed he makes Germans. I mean, if Varoufakis spoke German, you would mistake him for a member of the German political elite. He even dresses a bit like those German civil servants and think tank guys. So, my concern is I don't think he's right, though. I think that the postmodernist philosopher Frederick Jameson once said, it's easier, to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. I think it's easier to imagine the end of the world, to imagine this Europe within 10 years becoming democratized. I'm really sad about that, but that's the way I look at it.
I think we have time for one last question.
Okay. That's really good.
So we've talked about the economical crisis, and we always talk about the banks, and the financial problems of the situation. 3 days ago, the first immigrants have been deported from Greece back to Turkey, which we all know is not safe. Is not safe for them. So do you think that, apart from the financial problems, the crisis is not a financial one, but a moral one?
I think definitely. I think Europe and Greece is in a terrible, terrible situation, one that is potentially illegal, what's happening right now. I haven't spoken to anyone from Syriza about, I'm sure they would say that they're probably being blackmailed or that their hands are tied or, that they don't necessarily have a choice. I don't know what their answer would be, but it's awful what's going on. I mean, and who knows what is happening to the refugees who are being intercepted, on their way. No, how are we as journalists ever to actually, find that out?
I think another thing, though, is the deal, the refugee return deal, is probably illegal. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch say, and even the UN rapporteur says it's of questionable legality. But for Greece, it's imposed on them. Otherwise, in the sense that, of course, they could choose not to do it, but it's been made very clear to them that then their country will be just become a prison, and the migrants will be allowed to just live there. And already there's no welfare state. What you have to also understand with Greece, and it's a really unfortunate situation, that Syriza barely controls the state. I've described it that they squat ministries. The top floor is Syriza. The rest of the, it's well known that they will not communicate by text message with each other because they don't trust what is happening to the text. So to answer how, what the danger is, it is a moral crisis, and I think we should say to ourselves, it is a moral crisis. But the worst moral part of it is for a so-called democratic continent to be blackmailed by a guy who arrests thousands of journalists, who closes down newspapers. I'm talking about Recep Tayyip Erdogan, whose police fired CS gas canisters into the heads of journalists. Why? Why are we as a continent doing that deal? And if you think Greece is, in other words, being blackmailed by Europe, it is also Europe being blackmailed by Turkey. And really, what I expect politicians to do is stand up for values. But let's talk. You want more than that, I think. But yeah.
I'm sorry. Do you think that Tsipras has done his best?
I think on the refugee issue, they realized that they have no power whatsoever. At least with the economic thing, they had the power, they had a trigger they can pull. But with the refugee crisis, you pull that trigger and the gun is pointed at you. That is the gun of uncontrollable migration, no help, Visegrad countries effectively sabotaging you, razor wire, destroying Schengen, Dublin 3 in ruins. As I said, almost their only allies are the Germans, and the Germans are not really, it's not a life and death question. The Germans are really now coping, really critically with their migrant influx. So yeah, I think, I'll come back to it. It's a party that barely inhabits the state. The state in Greece, as you know, was designed to sabotage a left government. Just as, with the Gladio and the deep networks in Italy, they were rooted out and discovered. In Greece, they still exist. And nobody knows really how much control and how many levers Tsipras can actually pull until he pulls one. Shall we leave it there?
What, sorry?
Shall we finish?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, thanks for listening, and now I guess that let's enjoy the documentary.
Good.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.